The Nuns Who Never Took Their Vows. A dark tale from 1847, in the dead hush of January 1847, as a cruel Pennsylvania winter smothered the hills in ice and silence, 17 young women disappeared into the stone belly of St. Margaret's Convent, and only 3 would ever walk out again. They came willingly at first. Pale-faced daughters of Irish immigrants, devout and trembling with spiritual fervor, they arrived from all corners of the state. With rosaries tucked close to their hearts and prayers on their lips, they stepped across the iron threshold of the convent, eager to surrender their earthly selves to divine service. None of them suspected that within mere weeks their sanctuary would become a tomb, and that long before they could take their final vows, they would be tested not by temptation or doubt, but by something much older, much darker, and infinitely more cruel than sin. By spring 14 were dead, and of the 3 survivors, only 1 would ever speak of what happened during those months of ice and silence. Her name was Sister Catherine. She lived another 40 years, cloistered and nearly forgotten. And when she died in 1890, a sealed bundle of letters was found beneath her mattress pages, stained with tears wax and what some historians now believe was dried blood. These letters, hidden away in a forgotten archive in the Diocese of Greensburg, would remain unread for more than a century until now. What they reveal is not just the story of a tragedy. They are a confession, one that defies the laws of nature, faith, and reason. They suggest that something ancient and terrible was hiding within those convent walls, something the Church has spent generations trying to erase. What force could drive 14 pious women to madness and death inside a house of God? And what did the Church fear so deeply that it sealed the truth beneath vaults of silence? Tonight we dare to uncover what should have stayed buried. But first a warning. This story is not for the faint of heart. The shadows we're about to walk through are long, and the things that move within them are not always visible. But they leave traces, blood on the floorboards, claw marks on history, and screams too old to echo. So if you found your way here to this channel, to this moment, you are not like most. You are a seeker, a wanderer in the dark, curious about the whispers in forgotten places. If that's you, subscribe, hit the bell, and tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Because no matter where you are, some part of this story touches every corner of the country. Now, take a deep breath. We are going back to a time when America was young, raw, and trembling on the edge of faith and fear. The roots of suspicion. America's religious divide. The year was 1847, a time of turmoil, famine, and migration. Ireland was bleeding its people, fleeing starvation by the thousands, and many of them found refuge in the uncertain promise of America. Among their few constants was the Catholic faith, carried across the Atlantic like a fragile candle in a storm. But the New World was not ready to welcome them. In a land dominated by Protestant values and Puritan memory, Catholicism was not merely misunderstood, it was feared. Papist rituals, whispered confessions, and the very idea of cloistered convents where young women disappeared from the world ignited a frenzy of suspicion. In the streets and the newspapers, the seeds of paranoia flourished. Nowhere was this fear more venomous than in western Pennsylvania. Here, in the shadow of the Appalachians, Generations of Protestant families had carved out farms, churches, and lives. And when the Catholic Church began to erect its own outposts, stone sanctuaries nestled in the hills, many saw it not as coexistence, but as invasion. The press fed the flames. Stories spread of young women lured or forced into convents, of rituals conducted in darkness, of secret births and mysterious deaths. The Know Nothing Party, a political movement soaked in anti-Catholic venom, had taken root in the region. In their rallies, they accused the Church of everything from mind control to devil worship. Into this cauldron of suspicion rose St. Margaret's Convent, a towering, brooding monument to faith, isolation, and silence. St. Margaret's, a fortress of stone and secrets. 30 miles southeast of Pittsburgh, in the grey arms of Westmoreland County. The convent stood like something out of the old world alien, an immense wound stitched into the hills. Built in 1832 by German stonemasons, the convent's design was deliberately monastic and severe. 3 stories of quarried limestone carved with intimidating Gothic detail loomed against the sky. The windows' narrow slits of stained glass cast more shadow than light. The bell tower, tall and skeletal, stretched like a bony finger toward heaven, or perhaps pointed at something forgotten below. Its walls were 2 feet thick, cold to the touch, even in summer. In winter, they became deathly, pulling warmth from the living like leeches. Inside the halls were long and silent. Footsteps echoed for hours. Voices vanished into corners. The light from oil lamps barely reached past the arches. Some said the whole building breathed an intake of air when the wind howled through the eaves, an exhale when the pipes groaned at night. The sisters who lived there believed they were drawing closer to God. But the ones who arrived that January were stepping into a far older mystery, one the Church may have misunderstood when it built on that land, one that demanded not vows, but sacrifice. Chapter 2. The Sisters of Divine Mercy, an order born in shadows. St. Margaret's Convent was no ordinary religious house. It was a place of old rules, older secrets and rituals that smelled more of incense and blood than comfort and charity. The women who ruled its halls belonged to the Sisters of Divine Mercy, a strict French order rarely spoken of even within Catholic circles. They had arrived in the United States quietly, almost like specters, drifting in from a forgotten continent, and with them they brought a brand of spiritual discipline that felt medieval, even by 19th century standards. While other orders tended to the sick and the poor, healing wounds, teaching children, easing pain, the Sisters of Divine Mercy held a different philosophy. Suffering was not a curse to be healed, but a gift to be embraced. To suffer was to grow closer to God, to imitate Christ, not just in love, but in agony. They did not run schools. They did not tend hospitals. Their entire mission centered on what they called the perfection of the soul through holy affliction. Admission into the order was not granted easily. Only women between the ages of 18 and 25 were considered, and only those who could demonstrate not just exceptional piety, but also a certain stamina, both physical and spiritual. The process was not so different from joining a secretive military sect. Applicants were tested not with written exams, but with nights spent fasting, days filled with silence and emotional scrutiny that bordered on psychological torment. At the center of this strange, severe universe stood Mother Superior Agatha Russo, a woman who inspired both fear and reverence in equal measure. Mother Agatha, the Iron Veil. She was 53 years old in the winter of 1847, but there was nothing soft or weary about her. Mother Agatha moved with the rigid dignity of old-world nobility, as though she had once walked the halls of palaces rather than convents. She spoke English fluently, though her thick French accent lent even the most common phrases a strange otherworldly cadence. Simple prayers spoken by her tongue seemed to echo with something ancient and ominous. Her presence dominated every corridor of St. Margaret's. She needed no raised voice. Her icy blue eyes did all the work. The younger nuns whispered that she could see into your soul, that no secret survived her gaze. Whether they believed it out of superstition or experience, no one dared test the theory. Mother Agatha had fled France in the 1830s. During one of the many waves of political unrest. She claimed to have served in convents across Europe, Paris, Milan, Vienna, though when the Bishop of Pittsburgh requested official records, he received only vague letters filled with missing dates and contradictory titles. "She has been transferred," said one. "She served with distinction," claimed another, yet no one seemed able to say where or how. She arrived in Pennsylvania with crates of ancient books, veiled statues, and relics she claimed dated back to the first centuries of the church ossuaries. Fragments of old martyr bones and manuscripts written in dialects barely decipherable even to scholars. Her quarters were lined with these strange treasures, and she insisted that they were not simply decorative, but protective. To Mother Agatha, America was a spiritual wasteland, a place of soft morality and flabby devotion. She saw it as her sacred duty to carve a pocket of pure, blood-washed faith into its wilderness, and to do so, she would need obedient instruments. Discipline in the House of Mercy life at St. Margaret's was not built for comfort. It was built to grind away the self like sandstone on bone. Every day began at 4 a.m., summoned by the toll of the great bell. The nuns walked barefoot across freezing stone to the chapel, guided only by flickering candlelight. Their first prayers were whispered while their fingers turned blue in the unheated air. Breakfast was a bowl of thin gruel, usually cold, accompanied by a crust of bread hard enough to chip teeth. There was no talking. As they ate, Mother Agatha would read from obscure theological works in Latin or medieval French, pausing only to translate when the lessons grew especially grim. The rest of the day passed in near total silence. Long hours of kneeling prayer, manual labor in the convent's vast gardens and root cellars. The younger sisters were tasked with translating ancient religious texts not for publication, but for spiritual exercise. The logic was simple: if you could not suffer through boredom, repetition, and physical pain, you were not worthy of divine ecstasy. Laughter was not just discouraged, it was punished. A chuckle could earn a nun a week of silent isolation. A smirk during prayer. 3 nights sleeping upright in the chapel without food. For the novices, women still in training, the demands were even more extreme. Nights were often spent kneeling in prayer for hours, arms outstretched until joints throbbed. Simple meals became long fasts, Clean beds were replaced with floors cold enough to blister skin. Some were made to walk barefoot through the snow as penance for impure thoughts or hidden pride. And through it all, Mother Agatha watched. She explained that all of this was necessary, that to become one with God, they had to strip away the layers of worldly comfort to crush every remnant of ego desire and doubt. In her words, a soul must be emptied before it can be filled with light. And light, dear sisters, is not warm. It burns. Sister Catherine Murphy, the lamb among wolves. Among the 17 who entered the convent in that bitter January was a soft-voiced young woman from Philadelphia, Catherine Murphy, just 21, with wind-burned cheeks, calloused hands, and a heart filled with dreams. Born to Irish immigrants in the slums of the city, Catherine had seen more suffering by age 10 than most did in a lifetime. Her father Thomas was a dock worker who had coughed himself to death from tuberculosis by the time she was 16. Her mother, a woman caught between the old country and the new world, taught her daughter to read and write not just in English, but also in Gaelic. Catherine devoured scripture with a passion rare among the poor. She didn't come to the convent to be cleansed. She came to serve, to help, to heal. But she quickly discovered that St. Margaret's was not a place for helping the world. It was a place to disappear from it. She entered with hope in her eyes. Within weeks, those eyes had grown hollow. By March, she had stopped speaking altogether except during confession, which came daily whether the soul needed it or not. She would later be the only one to speak of what happened that winter. But even in her letters, she never wrote Mother Agatha's name directly. She called her only La Mère de Silence, the Mother of Silence. Chapter 3. The cold silence of winter. Catherine Murphy had entered the convent with hope in her heart and the light of the Sisters of Charity in her memory. In Philadelphia, she had watched them work women in grey habits, tending to the sick-feeding orphans, their hands worn but warm, their voices low and kind. She had believed that the religious life meant comfort in hardship, grace in labor, and above all, love in the face of suffering. But St. Margaret's was a different world, a different faith. And whatever spirit filled the cold stone walls of that hilltop convent, it was not the spirit of mercy. Her early letters to her family in Philadelphia were tender and filled with reverence. She wrote of long prayers, the discipline of silence, and the strength of the sisters she admired. But as the days turned to weeks, and autumn's chill hardened into winter's cruel fist, a slow unease began to creep into her words. She wrote of the cold, not just of the air, but of the heart of the place. The silence once sacred had become suffocating. The prayers, once beautiful, now sounded like pleas from prisoners. She mentioned the hunger too, though only gently at first. Her handwriting grew smaller, shakier, the tone more strained. These letters would remain hidden for over a century, sealed in a weather-stained trunk discovered in 1973 in the convent's attic. Their ink faded, but their terror undiminished. The winter of starvation. The winter of 1847 was among the harshest Pennsylvania had ever seen. Snow arrived early, a heavy, wet curtain that began falling in November and did not live until late March. By December, it smothered the land in silence. Drifts grew so high they reached the second-story windows of the convent. Doors froze shut. Windows creaked and groaned beneath the weight. The wind howled like a dying animal at night. The isolation became total. The sisters were cut off from the outside world. No visitors, no letters, no supply wagons, no oversight. The only contact came through Father Heinrich Metz, an elderly German priest who visited once a week to hear confessions and deliver Mass. But as the snow deepened and the roads vanished, even his visits became rare. The outside world forgot St. Margaret's. Inside, things began to decay. The convent had never relied heavily on outside provisions. Self-sufficiency was part of its spiritual creed. But the root cellar stores were never meant to stretch across a brutal winter. The gardens had long since vanished beneath 6 feet of ice, and the pickled vegetables and dried grains began to run out by early January. There was no meat, no milk, no fruit. Yet Mother Agatha made no concessions. Instead of easing the sisters' burden, she increased it. Hardship, she said, is the wine of angels. The flesh must be emptied so that the spirit may rise. The women toiled until their fingertips bled and their knees cracked from cold. They grew thin. Their lips split. Their movements slowed. Some began to faint during prayer, but the hunger was only the beginning. The purification rituals. In December, Mother Agatha summoned the novices to the refectory and made an announcement that chilled even their frozen blood. This winter, she said, her eyes glowing in the candlelight, will be a time of purification. The weak shall be refined. The strong shall be revealed. We have grown too much like the world outside. We must remember the ancient ways. She spoke of rituals long forgotten, of ancient Christian practices lost to the decadence of modernity. There was power, she said, in returning to what the early martyrs knew, a sacred knowledge passed down through suffering through blood. Those unworthy of these mysteries would be redirected to other forms of service. But those who proved themselves would ascend to a new level of divine understanding. No one knew exactly what that meant, but soon the nights grew stranger. The night of the weeping. On December 13th, Catherine Murphy was awakened by a sound she would never forget. It was not the morning bell, nor the rustle of feet headed to prayer. It was sobbing, soft, desperate, raw. She turned in the dark, the cold air burning her skin, and saw her roommate, Sister Mary Agnes O'Brien, just 19, newly arrived from Boston, hunched on the edge of the bed, her face in her hands. Her whole body shook. Mary Agnes Catherine whispered. The girl turned her eyes wide with terror and grabbed Catherine's arm with a strength born of pure fear. "They're taking us," she whispered, her voice nearly cracking. "To the chapel, one by one, in the middle of the night." Catherine's blood ran cold. "Some of us." Mary Agnes swallowed, trembling. "Some of us don't come back the same." She pulled Catherine closer, her breath hot against her ear. "Sister Elizabeth came back 3 nights ago, but she's not Elizabeth anymore. She doesn't speak. She won't eat. I saw her drinking something red, from a silver cup that Mother Agatha gave her. Her eyes, Catherine, her eyes reflect light, like an animal's, like glass." The chapel below, the chapel at St. Margaret's, was not above ground like most holy places. It was carved directly into the limestone beneath the convent, a subterranean sanctum of shadow and stone. It had been excavated decades earlier by the same German craftsmen who built the convent itself under the direct instruction of Mother Agatha. She said it was to protect the sacred rites from worldly interference, but Catherine suspected. There was another reason. The air in the chapel was always wet. The walls wept moisture that ran in rivulets across the stone, creating patterns that twisted and shimmered in candlelight. The flickering flames revealed symbols etched deep into the walls. These were not crosses, not saints. They were spirals that seemed to move when stared at two long geometric shapes that made Catherine's eyes ache. And stranger still symbols that looked almost human, but contorted limbs, bent backwards, heads turned upside down, mouths opened in impossible expressions of ecstasy and pain. Mother Agatha claimed they were ancient Christian markings, drawn from the catacombs of Rome, images of the first martyrs who had suffered for their faith. She said they were sacred, that their meaning had been lost to time, and only the purest could begin to understand their purpose. But Catherine, trained in a convent school in Philadelphia under Irish sisters, well versed in early church history, knew better. These were not Christian symbols, not Roman, not holy. They were older, and they hungered. Chapter 4. Blood beneath the stone. There are symbols older than language, older than civilization, some carved in bone, some etched in dreams, some buried in stone waiting to be remembered. And in the chapel beneath St. Margaret's convent, they were remembered. What Sister Catherine saw carved into the limestone walls, those spirals, those geometric mazes, those twisted near-human forms, did not belong to any church, Christian or otherwise. They weren't warnings. They weren't blessings. They were invitations. They whispered without sound. They reached for the eyes, for the heart, for the soul. And they did not let go. The altar that bled. At the center of the chapel sat the altar, though to call it that was a mercy to the mind. It was not a flat table for holy offerings, not a place for wafers and wine. It was a shallow depression, circular and unnatural, cut directly into the bedrock, ringed with channels that slithered away into darkness beyond the candlelight. Mother Agatha said it was an early Christian design created to properly receive consecrated offerings. But she never explained what exactly was being offered. Catherine had studied scripture. She had read about the sacred altars of Rome and the desert fathers of Egypt. None of them described anything like this. The stone around the basin was stained not with wine, not with oil, but with something darker, something that had soaked deep into the porous rock. In flickering candlelight, the stain seemed to pulse, move, breathe. It was not stone. It was memory. And it remembered blood. The visitation at midnight. The clock tower above the convent struck midnight, each chime echoing like a hammer on the gates of something buried. The sound did not wake the sisters. They were already awake, their dreams too restless for sleep. In the corridor, footsteps slowed, deliberate. And then the dormitory door creaked open, revealing a silhouette that made Catherine's heart seize. Mother Agatha stood at the threshold. Her face was cloaked beneath layers of dark silk, as were the two senior sisters, flanking her. Their faces hidden completely beneath heavy veils that swallowed light. Only their eyes, dark, gleaming voids, peered out from beneath the fabric. They held candles, but not like any candle Catherine had seen before. The flames were blue-white cold as ice casting warped shadows across the walls. The light distorted reality, making beds stretch into coffins. Walls pulse like skin, and rosaries look like chains. Mother Agatha spoke. Her voice, barely above a whisper, cut through the room like a scalpel. Sister Mary Agnes, she said, with a stillness that felt surgical. It is time for your private examination of faith. You have been chosen for a special honor, one that will test your dedication to our sacred mission. Come with us willingly, and you shall be rewarded with understanding beyond your current comprehension. Mary Agnes trembled. Her hands clutched the wool of her habit. She turned to Catherine once, just once, and her eyes, wide with terror, silently formed the words, "Help me." But Catherine could not move. The three veiled women turned and disappeared into the hallway, Mary Agnes between them. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold stone floor. Then the door closed behind them. The silence that followed felt final, not like sleep, but like burial. Waiting in the dark, Catherine pressed her ear against the heavy oak door. Nothing, not a whisper, not a cry. She crossed the dormitory to the narrow window that looked down onto the chapel wing, but the windows were covered, now thick curtains drawn tight. Still, a faint glow pulsed beneath the doorways, not from torches or candlelight, but from something else entirely, a kind of silent bioluminescence that seemed to seep through the stone itself. Catherine sat by the window and waited. Hours passed. The wind howled. Ice clawed at the window panes. Somewhere, something groaned a pipe, perhaps, or something older. Something hungrier. She dozed, jolted awake again and again by noises she could not place. Whispers that might have come from the walls. The tick of footsteps in places where no one walked. Then footsteps in the corridor. But they weren't Mary Agnes's quick, anxious steps. These were slower, measured, predatory. The door opened. Mary Agnes returns. In the pale light of the breaking dawn, Catherine saw her roommate return. It was Mary Agnes. It had to be, but it wasn't. She moved with fluidity, her limbs loose like water, her movements too perfect to be human. Gone was the nervous fidgeting, the half-hidden smiles. In its place was stillness, too still, like a doll just placed on a shelf. Mary Agnes turned to look at her, and Catherine froze. Her eyes, they reflected light. Not like candlelight in a glass, but like a beast's eyes in the dark forest. And behind that reflection, something moved. Smoke? No. Something that twisted, writhed, a shape without bones or name. Mary Agnes, Catherine whispered. No answer? Mary Agnes walked to her bed, lay down, fully clothed, eyes still open, staring at the ceiling as though watching stars only she could see. She didn't blink. Not once. She remained that way until the morning bell rang. The stranger in her bed. As the other novices stirred rising for morning prayer, Mary Agnes sat up, suddenly animated, suddenly aware. She looked around the dormitory as if seeing it for the first time. Catherine approached, trembling. "Do you remember anything about last night?" Mary Agnes blinked, confused. She shook her head. "I slept fine," she said softly. "Why?" Catherine stepped back. "You were gone. I wasn't. You were taken." Mary Agnes furrowed her brow. "You're mistaken." Catherine stared into those eyes, now dull human again. And for just a moment, she saw nothing. No recognition, no memory, nothing at all. Chapter 5. What returned was not her. In the days that followed, Mary Agnes's midnight summoning Catherine found herself haunted not by ghosts, but by the presence of something not quite human, walking beside her in the skin of a friend. Mary Agnes, once the most joyful of the novices, had become an echo of herself. She still wore the same habit, still plaited her hair in the same humble braid. But the soul beneath the surface had dimmed, or perhaps shifted. She could no longer read, or rather, she said she could. But the pages seemed to move beneath her eyes. The scriptures rearranged themselves. Letters bled into symbols, words twisted into spirals, into knots that her mind could not untangle. More than once, Catherine caught her staring blankly at the Gospel of John, murmuring nonsense syllables under her breath, like someone trying to remember a language they had never been taught. During communal prayers, Mary Agnes would often pause mid-verse. Her lips parted, her eyes fixed on some distant point in space. Catherine would watch her mouth move silently, as though responding to a voice no one else could hear. But most disturbing of all, she stopped eating. Each day, at the long wooden table, Mary Agnes would sit with the others, her hands neatly folded, or pushing the same morsel of bread from one side of her plate to the other. But she never ate, and yet her body did not weaken. While the other novices withered, their skin pale and stretched over bones, their cheeks hollowed by hunger, Mary Agnes seemed stronger. Her skin, far from gaunt, had taken on a strange sheen, a luminous waxen quality like polished alabaster. Her eyes, though dulled in moments, would occasionally flare with a sharp, almost animal brightness, catching candlelight like a cat's in the dark. She no longer seemed hungry, not for food, for something else. The words in the stone. 3 days after Mary Agnes's transformation, Catherine was assigned to clean the chapel, a task that made her blood turn cold, but that she accepted without protest. She knew now that something ancient had taken root in that stone womb beneath the convent, and she needed to understand what. Armed with a rag and pail of icy water, she descended into the subterranean chapel. She worked in silence, scrubbing the damp stone floor, whispering the rosary under her breath for courage. As she polished the base of the strange altar, the one with its dark basin and blood-drenched channels, her cloth snagged on something rough. She leaned closer. There, carved into the stone, nearly invisible, etched shallowly, and only revealed when the light struck at just the right angle, was a message scratched by a desperate hand. They are not what they seem. The old ways never died here. Trust no one, especially those who return changed. Find the hidden room behind the altar. The truth is written in the stones. Save yourself while you still can. M.A.O. Catherine's heart thudded in her chest. She recognized the handwriting instantly. Mary Agnes O'Brien. She had written this after her midnight summoning sometime in the haze between being taken and forgetting. The lines were fresh, still clean of dust, carved with something sharp and purposeful. The placement was deliberate, hidden in plain sight, where only a girl on her knees would find it. And yet, when asked the next morning, Mary Agnes remembered none of it. The pattern of the midnight rituals, the message shattered Catherine's illusions. She could no longer deny that something deeply unnatural was happening at St. Margaret's. And so she began to observe, quietly, carefully, as though her life depended on it. She noted every detail, every flicker of movement, every broken silence, and most importantly, every name whispered in the dead of night. Always at midnight, the dormitory door would creak open. Always Mother Agatha stood in the threshold with the two veiled sisters, their eyes like dark pits behind gauze. And always a name was called, a whisper, but it carried like thunder. Sister Elizabeth, Sister Sarah, Sister Rebecca. And one by one, the chosen novices would rise from their beds and follow into the dark barefoot and silent, as if some unseen tether pulled them. Catherine began to keep a hidden tally, scratching discreet marks beneath the wooden slat of her bed frame, where the morning inspectors never looked. By the end of January, 8 names had been called. Of those 83 never returned. No explanations, no funerals, not even empty beds. They were simply gone. The others who returned, and the 5 who did return, they were no longer the same. Sister Elizabeth Hartwell had once been warm, motherly. She returned with a face like porcelain and eyes like deep wells. She stopped speaking entirely. When pressed, she nodded or shook her head, but her voice had vanished. During chapel prayers, she would sometimes slip into a language none of them recognized. Not Latin, not French, but something low, harsh, and unearthly. It rolled off her tongue like gravel soaked in honey. Sister Sarah Morton had been devout and diligent, but upon her return, she winced at the sight of crucifixes as though they burned her. She avoided the chapel altogether, and during Mass, she sat in the farthest corner, eyes, averted, hands clenched tightly in her lap. When questioned, she whispered that the cross sings too loudly and that the altar drinks too much. Sister Rebecca Stone, barely 18, and the youngest in the convent, came back changed in a different way. She began speaking fluent Latin, though before she could barely recite the Hail Mary in English. She corrected the older sisters on obscure points of doctrine, quoted 4th century theologians, and debated with the kind of precision that no novice could possibly achieve. "Who taught you these things?" one asked. Rebecca only smiled. The expression 1,000 years old on a teenager's face sent chills down Catherine's spine. "I was taught," she said softly, "by excellent teachers." Whispers in the dark, it was no longer just a convent. It was a temple, and the women who entered the chapel at midnight were not just being tested. They were being rewritten, reforged in the stone womb beneath St. Margaret's. Whatever they were becoming, it was not what God had intended, and Catherine knew with every beat of her heart that her name would be called soon. Chapter 6. Beneath the habit, the hidden. The novices were changing. The walls whispered it. The floorboards felt it. Even the air, sharp with cold and iron, carried the scent of something unnatural, something ripe beneath the veil of piety. During the few hushed moments they were permitted to speak, the remaining girls huddled together like frightened birds in the dark, their backs to the wind, their voices just above breath. They whispered theories, desperate explanations. They were transferred. Maybe they've gone to another convent. They're being trained in secret like missionaries, right, hermits? Maybe this is a test. We're being watched. But Catherine had begun to see the pattern behind the veil, and what she saw terrified her. The sisters who did not starve. The senior sisters, the veiled ones, the ever-silent, should have been frail by now. The same bitter cold that turned the novices' fingertips blue should have crept into their bones. The same daily fasts and back-breaking chores that left Catherine light-headed and bruised should have worn down their strength. But they did not weaken. They thrived. Their skin, far from pale, seemed to glow with a soft, unholy light. Not healthy, not human, but luminous, like something born from a deeper fire. Their movements were too graceful, as though weight meant nothing to them. Their eyes, when visible beneath their veils, flickered, not with reflection, but with something that burned from within, even in the harshest frost. They walked barefoot on stone with no discomfort, no complaint. What fed them, what warmed them. The chapel speaks at night. Then came the sounds. The first time Catherine heard them, she told herself it was wind. Just the wind winding through cracks in the ancient stone. But as the days passed, she learned to listen more carefully, because the wind does not chant. It does not hum in harmonies that do not belong to men or women, but something between or beyond. The rhythms of midnight grew clearer with each passing night, chanting low and rolling in a tongue she could not identify. It wasn't Latin, French, or Gaelic. It was older, as though the syllables had been dredged from the throat of the earth itself. The tones didn't pass through the air. They passed through the stone, through bone vibrating in the very marrow of her teeth. And beneath the chanting other sounds, weeping, or perhaps singing distorted by distance and by stone. It echoed like a dream, soft and fragmented. And once on a night when the sky cracked open with moonlight, she heard laughter, but it was not laughter born of joy. It was sharp, cruel, a deliberate, knowing mockery, as though something hidden behind the chapel walls was enjoying the fear it cultivated. She heard scraping stone upon stone. She heard dripping not water, but something thicker. Mapping the forbidden Catherine began her own investigation, careful, secretive, quiet, as shadow. She memorized the structure of the convent as best she could during her cleaning duties. She paid attention to strange echoes, to corners that shouldn't exist, to doors that looked like walls. She realized that the inside of St. Margaret's was larger than its exterior. Hallways curved in ways that defied logic. Windows appeared in places where no windows should be. The convent had grown inward like a tumor. In the basement, where the chapel hunched in the rock like a sleeping beast, she found tunnels that were not marked on any plans. Some were used for mundane purposes: root cellars, tool storage, fermentation vats for herbs and bitter medicines. But others were silent chambers carved directly into the limestone. Empty, windowless, ritualistic. Their walls were decorated not with crosses, not with saints, but with the same symbols Catherine had seen in the chapel's spirals, twisted figures, and coiled shapes that seemed to squirm when the candlelight flickered. They were not Christian, not truly. The hidden room, then at last she found it, the place Mary Agnes had tried to warn her about. The hidden room behind the altar. She discovered it during her assigned cleaning. While scrubbing beneath the altar's lip, she noticed that one section of stone didn't quite fit. The mortar was too clean, too narrow. She ran her fingers across the symbols carved into the surface. One of them was a spiral flanked by two vertical slashes, a shape she had seen before, though she still didn't know its meaning. When she pressed it, something behind the wall clicked. The altar groaned. Stone scraped against stone. A section of the wall opened inward, revealing a passage behind the altar that no one had spoken of, a small, low tunnel leading to a chamber that smelled of earth blood and old parchment. Inside, the light of her candle seemed to retreat, reluctant to enter. The books of the buried church. Catherine stepped into the hidden room. It was dry, too dry, as if the air inside had not been disturbed for years, or perhaps had been disturbed too often. There were books stacked high on crude wooden shelves. But these were not scripture. They were older, stranger. Some were bound in cracked leather. Others were written on vellum that shimmered like skin. And the languages, oh God, the languages, some resembled Greek or Aramaic, but written backward, mirrored or spiraled across the pages. Some volumes bore no writing at all, only symbols, drawings of anatomy, but not human. Creatures with elongated skulls, limbs with too many joints, eyes that floated separately from heads. Catherine found one book brittle with age that opened to a diagram of a woman's body, annotated in red ink with foreign glyphs. But the womb was not a womb. It was an altar, and beside it, a drawing of the chapel floor she had scrubbed for weeks, etched with the same channels and depression. Only here the diagram labeled them with terms she could not translate, except one, vessel of rebirth. The walls were watching. Catherine backed away. The air in the room had changed. It felt aware. Somewhere deeper in the stone, something groaned. Not wood, not earth, but something alive. She turned to flee, heart pounding. But as she passed through the secret door and returned to the chapel, she heard it again. Laughter, not loud, but close. And this time, it knew her name. Chapter 7. The Ledger of the Consumed. The pages were alive, not in the sense of motion or breath, but in the way old wounds throb before a storm. The room behind the altar was a reliquary, but not of saints. A reliquary of something far older, far darker, a faith that fed. The books were written in too many hands, in too many tongues. Some bound in cracked, blistered leather, others wrapped in stiff cloth that rustled like dry skin. Some texts were hundreds of years old, their vellum browned and flaking ink faded like dried blood. Others were freshly written, clean, modern, and deeply disturbing in their clarity. They all spoke of one thing: transformation, not salvation, not enlightenment, transformation, the doctrine of the flesh. Catherine leafed through a thick manuscript, its ink still dark and sharp French, a language she understood only partially. The title at the top of the first page sent a chill straight through her spine. La transformation divine, the divine transformation. What followed read more like a surgical manual than scripture. The text detailed a long methodical process by which ordinary human beings could be elevated to a higher state of existence, not through prayer, not through grace, but through the reconstruction of the soul. It began with isolation and sensory deprivation, the gradual dismantling of the subject's identity. Then came the introduction of the sacred substance, an unnamed liquid described as thick, dark, and consecrated, through rites lost to the known church, passed down through generations of initiates. It was this substance, the text claimed, that opened the soul, made it hospitable to something else. The vessel must be emptied to be filled. The text stated, all prior memory, all identity must be burned away. The sacred will not tolerate the profane. The subject, once transformed, ceased to be herself. The text praised this change as joining the eternal wisdom. But Catherine saw it for what it was, possession, a soul burned clean, so that something older could crawl inside. The ledger of Agatha. At the far end of the chamber, laid upon a plain wooden lectern, was a ledger, a thick leather-bound book whose cracked spine bore no title. But Catherine recognized the handwriting immediately. Mother Agatha. She turned the brittle pages with trembling fingers. Each entry bore the name of a young woman, not just the current novices, but others Catherine had never met. Dozens, perhaps hundreds. Every entry followed a meticulous pattern. Name, background, personal characteristics, mental disposition, physical endurance, notes on willingness and malleability, and then, underlined in red ink, a heading labeled Selection Process. Some girls were marked successfully integrated. Their roles were updated. Senior sister, choir mistress, midnight guardian. Others were marked unsuitable for integration, followed by brief clinical comments, emotional instability, excessive resistance, lack of faith. But a few ended with a single terrible word, consumed, followed by a date, and nothing more. Catherine's stomach turned. Her breath caught in her throat. Then she found her own name. Her heart nearly stopped. Potential for integration unclear. Murphy Catherine, Irish descent, age 21, literate in English and Gaelic, high intelligence, strong-willed, demonstrates troubling independence of thought. Potential for integration unclear. Note, may require special handling if resistance develops. Monitor closely for signs of awareness. Her hands trembled as she clutched the book. Special handling. It wasn't just that they were watching her. They knew she was watching back. Her name, beautiful in her father's voice, sacred on her mother's lips, had been reduced to a dossier, a line item in a spiritual meat grinder. The convent was not a sanctuary. It was a machine. Who could she tell the truth weighed on her like whetstone? She could no longer pretend that this was some strange aberration of strict religious discipline. This was intentional, systemic, a decades-long operation designed to lure, break, transform, or consume. But knowledge alone meant nothing if she could not act on it. Could she warn the others? Could she even speak this truth aloud without sounding mad? And even if she could, who would believe her? Then a chance. The word that opened the door. The kitchen was a rare reprieve. The clang of pots and the hiss of boiling water gave cover to quick glances and hurried whispers. There Catherine found herself beside Sister Margaret O'Brien, a wiry girl from Boston with observant eyes and a skepticism that bordered on defiance. Her father had been a doctor, and Sister Margaret had inherited not just his critical mind, but his sharp instinct for patterns. Catherine had seen her watching the changed novices, noting their odd behavior. The luminous skin, the distant gaze, the way they seemed to listen to things no one else could hear. And so, when the moment came, as their hands met over a tray of bread, and the watchful eyes of Mother Agatha were absent, Catherine leaned in her lips, barely parting, and said just one word. Basement? Margaret froze. Her eyes widened, then slowly she nodded, and Catherine knew she was no longer alone. Chapter 8. The five who remembered that night, Margaret slipped through the black corridors of the convent like a ghost. The wind outside howled against the stone walls, and snow pressed against the windows like a white tombstone. The convent slept, or at least the parts of it that still needed sleep. She crept barefoot past the veiled statues in the hallway, down to the storage room beside the kitchen, where the scent of brine and rot clung to the wooden barrels like a warning. There, in the darkness, thick with mildew and whispers, Catherine waited. The air was damp and sour with stored grain and cold turnips, but it was the only place that offered both privacy and obscurity, a forgotten room in a house of secrets. Catherine did not speak at first. She simply opened the book. A flickering candle cast light onto the page, illuminating a diagram. A human silhouette with tendrils extending from its spine into a halo of interlocking eyes. Margaret stared. Her breath caught. Her hands trembled. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew something was wrong." The physician's daughter, Margaret O'Brien, had a scientist's mind. Her father had taught her to observe symptoms before stories. And what she had observed about her roommate, Sister Elizabeth, was monstrous. "She doesn't eat," Margaret said, voice low and shaking. "Not really. She pretends, moves the food, chews nothing. And she's been drinking something thick, dark red. Mother Agatha brings it in a separate cup. No one else gets that cup." But there was more. Her body temperature cold, always cold, even when we're standing by the fire. And sometimes, I swear to you, she forgets to breathe. Minutes pass before she takes a breath again. Her voice cracked then. "Catherine, that's not Sister Elizabeth anymore." Together, they built a profile not of a haunted convent, but of an infection masquerading as sanctity. A methodical process, ancient and precise. They were watching it happen like surgeons observing an autopsy on the living. They weren't the only ones. The ones who still wept. Over the following days, they found the others, 3 more novices who hadn't yet changed. Each was unraveling in her own way. Sister Anne Fitzgerald, just 18, and barely holding herself together, had been scratching prayers into her cell walls, fingernails bleeding, muttering to herself in Gaelic. Sister Rose McKenna, her roommate, vanished without a trace, now slept with a crucifix bound to her wrists, with rosary beads, murmuring Psalm 91 like a warding spell. Sister Clara Walsh, The quiet, brilliant girl with inquisitive eyes had dug through records no novice should have touched. Working as Mother Agatha's secretary, Clara had uncovered more than forgotten paperwork. She had discovered a pattern of vanishing girls. What the records revealed, Clara's findings, confirmed what Catherine and Margaret had feared. The church's official records claimed that dozens of sisters had passed through St. Margaret's over the past 15 years, ordained assigned to missions, and sent away. But when Clara cross-referenced those names with diocesan archives, there was nothing. They vanished, Clara whispered in the flickering candlelight. Ordained on paper, erased in life, and the letters from families, mothers and fathers who had written to the convent, asking after daughters who never wrote home, all given the same response. She has chosen a path of contemplative silence. She is called to serve in remoteness where letters cannot reach. She is fulfilled in her vocation, but there's never proof, Clara said. No return letters, no visits, no photographs, just silence. The gathering storm. The five of them, Catherine, Margaret, Anne, Rose, and Clara, became their own kind of secret order. The last sisters, they called themselves in whispers, as if naming the truth might make it bearable. Catherine brought the texts. Margaret brought medical knowledge. Clara brought the evidence. Anne and Rose brought faith and fear. Together, they uncovered what was now undeniable. The Sisters of Divine Mercy were not simply a corrupt convent. They were something inhuman, wearing the mask of holiness to mask a slow parasitic ritual older than Rome. Their methods were elegant in their cruelty. They chose remote places. They recruited from poor families and distant towns. They maintained just enough contact with the outside world to appear legitimate, and anyone who disappeared could be explained away with doctrinal silence. The transformation process they now understood was gradual, irreversible, and ritualized. The women who returned from the chapel in the night were not chosen. They were being converted into vessels, not saints, not brides of Christ, hosts. The rules of the process. Through whispered planning and dangerous observation, the five sisters identified the stages of the change. Summoning at midnight always by Mother Agatha and two veiled figures. Silence and forgetting, the novice returns, altered, unable to recall the ritual. Behavioral distortion speech. Appetite prayer. All slowly replaced by alien patterns. Physiological changes. Pale skin, cold flesh. Loss of breath and hunger. Integration. The final phase where the body becomes permanent housing for what Catherine called the unseen occupant. And those who resisted, they didn't stay. They didn't speak. They simply vanished. A covenant of resistance. In the cellar of the convent, amidst sacks of onions and pickling jars, the five made a pact. They would resist. They would record. They would find proof. And if they could not stop what was happening, they would expose it, even if it cost them their lives. We are the last ones left, Margaret said. If we fall, no one will ever know what happened here. The cold silence of the convent pressed in on them listening, and from deep below, where the rock wept and the ancient altar bled darkness, something stirred. Chapter 9. The trap springs shut the midnight examinations. They realized too late were not rites of passage. They were not moments. They were doors once opened, never fully closed. Each novice who returned from them did so as a different person. Not all at once, not obviously, but slowly, inevitably, like a fire-consuming silk, leaving the shape intact, but the essence destroyed. What horrified Catherine most was not the change in her companions. It was the sudden realization that the senior sisters, those cold, luminous-eyed women who floated through the halls in silence, had once been just like her. The ledger's final secret. In Mother Agatha's own ledger, buried among records and notes, Catherine found a list of the convent's original founders. They were names she recognized, idolized, even spoken of in chapel sermons as paragons of purity and discipline. But deeper research revealed another truth. These founding sisters had not come from established convents in France as the story went. They had arrived in America as novices, barely 18 or 19, seeking a life of devotion. They had come here to be transformed, and they had succeeded. Now they served not God, not the church, but something older, something hungry, hidden behind holy symbols and candlelight. Catherine knew what that meant. They were next. Plans of snow and silence. The 5 young women met in hurried whispers, their fear now sharpened into desperation. The roads were impassable. The forest was too deep. There was no help coming, even if they could escape. Who would believe them? They were orphans, immigrants, poor Irish girls raised in back alley parishes. They had no proof, only each other's testimony, and the mad fragments of forbidden knowledge carved into stone and vellum. The world would call them hysterics. The church would call them liars. And the convent would call them missing. The final gathering, on the night of March 10th, 1847, they gathered for what was to be their last meeting. A plan had been forged, dangerous, imperfect, but better than waiting for their turn to be taken. They would escape through the root cellar tunnels, past the old wine storage and the hollowed-out limestone chamber that Catherine suspected had once been used for something far older than gardening. But when they entered the storage room, they found it already occupied. The revelation. Mother Agatha was seated on a barrel of grain, her hands folded calmly in her lap, like a queen awaiting confession. Behind her stood 6 senior sisters, materializing from the shadows, as if the walls themselves had given birth to them. The candlelight bent strangely around them, flickering but never warming. Catherine froze. So did Margaret. Rose gripped her cross tighter. Clara gasped. Anne's knees buckled slightly. My dear children. Mother Agatha's voice was soft, and it slithered between the girls like incense. Did you really believe your little conspiracies went unnoticed? Her smile was not warm. It was the smile of a surgeon before a necessary incision. This house has been ours for 15 years. Every stone, every echo, every flicker of doubt belongs to us. We have watched you struggle, watched you question, watched you hope. Hope, she said again, almost sadly, is the most delicious lie. Faces of the inhuman. The senior sisters stepped forward, and for the first time their veils were gone. They were not old. Not really. Or perhaps they were so old that time no longer touched them in recognizable ways. Their skin was smooth, but stretched like wax poured too thin over bone. Their cheekbones jutted at impossible angles. Their jaws hung too long. Their eyes, deep black hollows, ringed with faint silver, shimmered with something that was not light, but reflected memory. Not human memory, not theirs. They used to be like us, Catherine thought. Girls, sisters, dreamers. Now they're hosts. She wanted to scream, but the moment felt frozen, suspended between breaths. Mother Agatha stood. Do you think you're the first? You are not the first. You will not be the last. The world offers many children. We simply teach them what the world has forgotten to fear. She stepped forward, now her eyes locked on Catherine. You're afraid, because what you've seen does not match what you were told. But it is truth, child. Raw and ancient and merciful in its own way. You call it evil. We call it the beginning. The circle closes. The senior sisters closed in, not attacking, but encircling like mourners at a funeral. The 5 girls stood back to back, trembling, staring at the monsters they might one day become. This is not punishment, Mother Agatha said. This is elevation. You should feel honored. Her voice was a lullaby now, and Catherine felt something crawling in her skull. A suggestion. A pull. Come forward. Let go. Be remade. But Catherine remembered something Margaret had said in that first secret meeting. If you forget who you are, even for a moment, you'll never come back. And so, standing in that circle of candlelight and monsters, Catherine did not forget. What comes next? The story paused there. The final confrontation had begun. But it was not a battle of swords or fists. It was a war of memory, of identity, of souls. 5 girls, 6 creatures, 1 convent, and deep beneath it all, in the chapel, where no god dwelled, something older was waking. Chapter 10. The Offer and the Ultimatum. The faces of the senior sisters were beyond human now, parodies of sanctity, pale masks stretched too tightly over something ancient and coiled beneath. But it was their eyes that broke Catherine. They reflected the candlelight, not like glass or water, but like the lens of a predator deep in the woods. The way a fox watches a rabbit before it pounces. They smiled, and their teeth glinted like ivory needles, too long, too sharp, too perfectly clean. Their bodies moved with a gliding smoothness that defied the mechanics of human joints, as if the bones inside had been remade, and yet they still wore the habits of nuns, as if mocking the faith they once served. The sermon of the damn mother, Agatha, rose her limbs, unfolding with a grace that felt like blasphemy. We want you to understand, she said. This is not punishment. It is elevation. Her voice was velvet, stretched over something metallic. She addressed them like a teacher to eager pupils, though the circle of transformed women now closing in made the air feel like it was thickening. The fear you feel, Agatha continued, is the fear of the caterpillar resisting the end it cannot comprehend. But what is a chrysalis if not a tomb? Catherine swallowed, then forced her voice through the tremor in her throat. What are you? What have you done to them? Mother Agatha's smile spread wider than seemed possible. We are what your kind can become, she said, when it abandons the myths of flesh and guilt. Your sisters, your friends, they have tasted the sacred transformation, the cost of failure. Margaret stepped forward, her jaw tight with fury and the bitter knowledge of anatomy. And those who failed the transformation, she asked, what happened to them? Agatha's response came without hesitation, almost cheerfully. Nothing is ever wasted, she said. Some serve as vessels, others nourish. Their essence sustains us, their life force, their spiritual residue, their faith. It's a beautiful cycle, truly. The temporary feeds the eternal. The senior sisters crept closer, the air now thick with the scent Catherine had once dismissed as incense and herbs. It was metallic and sweet, like overripe fruit cut with blood, and beneath that, something ancient, something feral. The choice. Agatha raised her arms, addressing the 5 novices as if delivering benediction. You have a choice, she said. Submit willingly, and you may retain some memory of who you were. The transformation will be gentle, painless, sublime, or resist, and be taken anyway. Her eyes gleamed as she looked at each girl in turn. But know this resistance comes at a cost. What you are will be scraped away like meat from bone, and you will awaken as something else, with no memory of love or God or home. Anne sobbed aloud, collapsing to her knees, clutching the rosary she had once believed could protect her. We just wanted to serve God, she whimpered, to help people. Mother Agatha knelt beside her, pale fingers stroking Anne's hair. And you shall, she murmured, but not the God of your childhood. He is dead, child, or dreaming, or watching with envy as we rise, an ancient purpose. She stood again, gesturing with slow, reverent movements, as if conducting a dark mass. Before your Christ walked among men, we served the old orders, the ones buried beneath catacombs and written in blood and flame. We have lived within the church, worn its garments, spoken its prayers, and used its architecture to reach those who hunger for more than grace. We are not demons. We are evolution. We are what comes next. Rose's defiance. It was Rose, trembling and wide-eyed, who found her voice. No, she said, barely more than a breath. You're demons. You're talking about selling our souls. Agatha laughed, and the laugh was not right. It was the sound of something cracking, like glass under strain, like bone under slow pressure. Demons, souls, she echoed. Child, your species clings to these fairy tales like a blind man clutching a spider's web. We have simply learned to cast off the shackles of mortality. What you call a soul is a pattern of memory and desire. We preserve that pattern, elevate it, expand it. We are not monsters. We are the future of faith, the communion of the damned. As the circle tightened, Catherine saw it. Each of the senior sisters now carried a cup, tarnished silver, etched with symbols that writhed when stared at too long. Inside the cups was a dark, viscous liquid that shimmered with its own sickly pulse. It moved, it breathed. One of the cups tilted slightly, and a droplet slid to the floor landing with a soft hiss. The stone smoked where it touched. "Drink," Agatha said, "and awaken." The decision, the room pulsed with silence. The girls looked at one another. Margaret's fists clenched. Clarara's lips trembling with silent calculation. Anne's sobbing rose, shaking with righteous fury. And Catherine? Catherine took a step back, her eyes never leaving the cups. "No," she said. Mother Agatha's head tilted, her smile fading. "No," she echoed. "I would rather die human," Catherine said, "than live as whatever you are." Behind her, Margaret nodded. So did Clara, even Anne through her tears. "We choose," the dark rose whispered, "but not your darkness, to be continued." And that was the moment, the first time in decades, that someone refused the sacred cup. What happens when a sacrifice says no? What happens when 5 girls choose death over transformation? The story is far from over. If you're breathless, don't forget to share this video, like the channel, and hit subscribe, because in the next chapter, the Sisters of St. Margaret's will learn what happens when their victims refuse to go quietly, and when the old things hidden beneath stone and prayer awaken hungry and denied. Chapter 11. The Sacred Poison and the Spark of Rebellion. The stench hit Catherine like a slap to the face. It radiated from the cups the sisters held with reverent hands, a nauseating blend of copper and decay, like old coins soaked in funeral lilies. It was thick enough to taste in the air. Catherine gagged, her stomach tightening. The process is quite simple. Mother Agatha began, her voice now taking on the clipped cadence of a classroom instructor. The sacred substance you see before you is the distilled inheritance of forgotten empires, consecrated through rites older than language. Her pale eyes gleamed. The other sisters closed in with movements so smooth they seemed to float. When consumed, it begins the unraveling of your current self. Agatha explained, lifting her cup slightly. Your limits will fall away. Your vision will stretch into new dimensions. And over several days, you will awaken as more. Science versus sacrament. Margaret took a step back, her instincts snapping into clinical clarity. "That's poison," she said flatly. "You're talking about a neurotoxin, a psychoactive compound." Agatha's smile never faltered. Poison is such an ugly word. But I suppose that's what all transformation looks like to the uninitiated. Medicine is poison, depending on the hand that administers it. "Your friend Mary Agnes fought too," she added casually. "But she serves joyfully now. In fact, she volunteers to guide new initiates through the visions. She's quite gifted." Margaret's face twisted with revulsion. That wasn't healing. That was erasure. The scale of the horror. Catherine's heart pounded, but her mind was racing faster. What she was witnessing wasn't just a violation of their own convent. It was the tip of a monstrous iceberg. If Agatha was telling the truth, then St. Margaret's wasn't alone. How many convents and monasteries harbored these rituals beneath their foundations? How many missing sisters had been absorbed into something that pretended to be holy? And how many others, girls like her, had walked willingly into obliteration, disguised as salvation? Her thoughts were interrupted by Clara's voice, cool and unshaken. "You're not offering a choice," she said. "You're issuing terms. Comply or lose your mind." Agatha's head tilted slightly. There was a flicker pride amusement in her expression. "Very good child. You understand the truth. And such clarity of thought is valuable. Yes, you will all be transformed. But your attitude determines what remains of you after. Compliance is rewarded. Resistance is corrected. The chalices rise. As one, the senior sisters raised their cups. The liquid inside shimmered like blood mixed with oil. And something moved within it, threads or worms, or perhaps just the hallucination of Catherine's overstimulated mind. Tiny shapes swimming in a crimson sea, alive, hungry. "We will begin with the most resistant," Agatha intoned. "Sister Catherine Murphy, you will be the first." The spark, a terrible stillness, settled over the room. Catherine felt her fear harden into something sharper cold, metal-edged. Not panic, not despair, anger. It pulsed in her chest like a second heartbeat. They had stolen lives, turned sacred ground into a factory for the damned, cloaked their perversion in the robes of faith. Catherine would not let her final act be submission. She raised her chin and met Agatha's eyes. "You made a mistake," she said, her voice clear and rising like a battle cry. "You assumed we came here tonight without a plan." Agatha blinked the first visible crack in her mask. "What do you mean?" Catherine's lips curled into a smile. "We've been preparing for weeks. We know about the hidden chamber behind the altar. We've read your ledger, your records." She took a step forward. The sisters hesitated, but more importantly, she continued. "We know about the letters." To be continued. Letters. Mother Agatha's fingers stiffened slightly around her cup. The other sisters faltered not visibly. Not enough for a stranger to see, but Catherine saw it. A microsecond of doubt. They hadn't known about the letters. Whatever Catherine meant, it had shaken them. And in a battle like this, a single crack in the enemy's armor could mean survival. What letters? What secrets had Catherine and Clara uncovered? And could those secrets destroy an order centuries old? The story is racing toward its climax. Like this video if your heart's pounding. Subscribe if you need to know what happens next, and share it with someone brave enough to face what lies beneath the altar. Chapter 12. The Tolling and the Terror. Catherine's bluff had been a desperate grasp in the dark, but it struck with the force of a blade. "The letters," she said, her voice steady, though her heart thundered to Bishop Ali in Pittsburgh. For the first time, Mother Agatha flinched. A muscle twitched along her jaw. Clara, sharp and unhesitating, saw the opening and stepped in. They contain everything she lied smoothly. Detailed accounts, dates, names. They're hidden safe. If anything happens to us, they'll be delivered. This was half true. Clara had kept notes, scattered through margins of psalms and tucked inside the pages of her prayer book. But no letter had ever been sent. Still, the effect was instant and electric. Agatha's eyes narrowed. Her facade of cold elegance fractured. "Impossible," she snarled. "We monitor all correspondence. Nothing leaves without our approval, Father Metz Margaret said suddenly. The German priest who visits weekly, he's been carrying them. The words tumbled out before she could stop herself. It was a lie. Father Metz hadn't made the journey since January, snowed out by the brutal Pennsylvania winter. But it struck like lightning. He has friends in Pittsburgh. We gave him everything weeks ago. The room changed in a breath. Mother Agatha let out a sound. No human should make a strangled blend of howl and screech, layered with something guttural and ancient, a language with no vowels and too many consonants. The senior sisters began to move erratically. Their fluid grace gave way to twitching, spasming contortions like puppets yanked by tangled strings. Their human faces began to slip like melting wax. "You stupid, meddling children!" Agatha shrieked, her voice now laced with dissonant harmonics that rattled the shelves and made the oil lamps flicker. "Do you know what you've done? We have operated in silence for decades, preparing, waiting for the moment when we might rise from the shadows." Her skin split and shimmered, revealing the shape beneath. They were no longer pretending, the true faces of the divine. What emerged from the broken shells of habit and veil was a grotesque echo of what had once been human. Limbs too long, too many joints bending in the wrong directions, skin translucent like wet parchment, pulsing with the movement of dark, sluggish veins, eyes black and wet, shining like obsidian, glowing with an inner light that seemed to stare through time, and their faces sliding between forms like clay, reshaped by an unseen hand. Sometimes it was Agatha's face, sometimes a child's, sometimes something reptilian and ancient. They advanced with renewed purpose. The silver chalices glimmered, the thick liquid inside still quivering with unnatural life. "We are the future of your kind." Agatha growled, teeth now fully visible, long, sharp, glistening. "You will be transformed. Even if you forget yourselves forever, you will serve." Catherine braced herself. There was nowhere to run. And then the bells. It came like a blade of light slicing through shadow. Bells, not the dull clang of iron or the cracked tolling of the convent's disused tower. These bells were pure and bright, crystalline, and bright as winter sunlight. They rang across the hills, silver and defiant, like the voice of heaven tearing open the sky. The creatures screamed. Every sister, still bearing a chalice, dropped it with a shriek as if burned. The cups shattered on the stone. The liquid inside hissed and steamed like blood exposed to flame. They clutched their heads, howling in pain, collapsing into spasms of unnatural movement. Catherine froze, unable to process what she was seeing. Divine intervention, it seemed impossible. Could heaven truly be watching? But the truth she would later learn was even stranger. The bishop arrives. It was Bishop Patrick Marley, come from Pittsburgh, with a full company of churchmen and lawmen, summoned not by letters or prayers, but by the suspicion of a single overlooked man, Father Heinrich Metz. He had not received letters, but he had noticed silence. He had watched the snow fall, and the usual requests for communion, wine, and medicine never arrive. He had grown uneasy at the sudden disappearance of novices, who once sent him confessions. And eventually he had acted. He brought not only bells, but witnesses and sanctioned authority and consecrated tools meant to face things the church no longer spoke of aloud, shattering the silence. In the chaos that followed, the remaining 5 novices fled, running not through the convent halls, but down into the network of tunnels Catherine had mapped. Behind them, the silver bells rang on louder, faster. The transformed sisters thrashed and wept and clawed at the stone as if the very sound was rending their souls apart. Catherine turned back once and saw Mother Agatha for the last time, not as a woman, not even as a monster, but as a dying idea, a once hidden evolution brought into the light and unraveled by the oldest of human weapons: faith, truth, and sound. Chapter 13. The Bells, the Bishop, and the Exorcism of the Flesh Father. Heinrich Metz had always been a quiet, solitary man. A German by birth and a priest by discipline, he had served the Diocese of Pittsburgh for over 40 years, his faith as steady as the Appalachian hills around him. But beneath his simple robes and weathered Bible, Father Metz carried secrets known to few. He was not merely a country priest. He was a watcher, a silent agent of an ancient order hidden within the Vatican's forgotten libraries, and whispered only in the oldest halls of the Church. This unnamed brotherhood had but one purpose: to seek out the places where the divine had been inverted, where faith was not worshipped, but fed upon. So when the winter passed and the road to St. Margaret's Convent reopened, Father Metz rode out alone, not out of curiosity, but because his silence had grown too deep. The letters had stopped. The convent, always devout in its correspondence, had fallen eerily still, and what he found upon arrival shook him to his core. The ritual below the basement chapel was never meant to be used at night. But Metz, arriving unannounced, heard the voices, a low, rhythmic chant like water boiling beneath stone. He descended the back stairwell and witnessed it through the half-open door. A circle of veiled figures swaying unnaturally. An altar soaked in crimson with a novice girl motionless atop it. Her name had been recorded as transferred, and the eyes of the sisters glowing faintly, their irises no longer human. He left without a word. He rode straight through the night, and within 48 hours, Bishop Patrick Marley was standing at the head of a specialized rescue party, armed not just with sacraments, but with weapons of faith, crafted through centuries of hidden war. Faith as weapon. The silver bells they carried were not ceremonial. Each was forged from blessed metals baptized in holy water, each inscribed with words of spiritual rupture: Illuminator tenebrae frangitur falsitas. Let the darkness be illuminated, let falsehood be broken. The sound was not merely symbolic, it was a weapon, a resonance that shook the creatures loose from the flesh they wore. As the bells pealed through the convent's walls, the senior sisters fell one by one, their human masks melting like candle wax in fire. What remained behind was unspeakable. The flesh beneath the habit, their bodies bent wrong spines arching backward like bows drawn to breaking, skin peeled into membranes of shadow, curling with veins of glowing rot. Their movements became glitching spasms, as if time itself had become unthreaded around them. Their mouths split vertically, revealing teeth, not meant for prayer, but for draining the soul from innocence. Even Catherine, who had seen the ledger, the liquid, the impossible eyes, felt her knees buckle. Only one remained standing. Mother Agatha unveiled. She was not like the others. She did not collapse. Her transformation was slower, more deliberate, as though she allowed the disguise to fall. And what emerged was almost beautiful. Tall, regal, radiant, with a corrupted elegance, her face a fusion of ancient humanity and something older still. Her limbs, elongated fingers ending in delicate claws, her eyes, dark whirlpools of memory and hunger. Her presence exuded the unbearable gravity of something timeless. "You think you've won?" she hissed, as Bishop Marley and his men entered the storage room, their crosses glowing with inner fire. "You understand nothing of what we are." The young women huddled behind Margaret Clara Ara, and Catherine watched in paralyzed awe as Mother Agatha advanced, not fearful, but triumphant. "We are eternal," she said. "We have worn the skins of abbesses, nuns, and cardinals. We have whispered in the ears of confessors and fed upon the faithful. Every parish is a seed, every cathedral a mouth." She grinned, revealing rows of translucent fangs. "For every nest you burn, 10 more will bloom. Your faith is our disguise, and your faithful our feast." The response of the church, but Bishop Marley was unmoved. He stepped forward, silver cross held high, and his voice was quiet, so quiet that even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. "You are not eternal," he said. "You are not even original." He drew forth a crucifix wrought from meteoric iron, its base set with relics of saints long dead. "You are parasites, scavengers of the sacred. You feed on what you cannot create. You mimic the form of faith, but you will never know its substance." And then he began to speak, not in Latin alone, but in a polyphonic chant, woven from Latin Aramaic and something older, still a language that buzzed beneath the surface of reality, like bees in a buried hive. The air shimmered, the walls groaned, the creatures screamed. The rending Catherine covered her ears as sound and light burst from the bishop's mouth like fire through a keyhole. The silver bells rang again, not by hand, but as if stirred by the wind of creation itself. The transformed sisters burned from within their skin, cracking, spilling light instead of blood. And Mother Agatha, still defiant, still proud, let out a shriek so ancient it might have been the scream of Eden closing behind the first exile. "You will never win," she said as she fell to her knees. "We are within you, in your churches, in your prayers, in your weakness." The bishop raised the cross high one last time. "Let the sacred truth consume the lie." And with that final word, Agatha ignited not with flame, but with memory. Visions spilled from her like smoke. Rome-burning children, lost in stone crypts, whispered masses in the dark. Then nothing, only silence, only ash. The aftermath, the creatures were gone. The convent was gutted by more than fire, it had been spiritually cleansed. The bells ceased. The silver crosses dimmed. The bishop wept, and Catherine, She stood at the threshold of the chapel surrounded by her sisters, her hands shaking. What had begun as a search for meaning had ended in apocalypse, and somewhere deep in her soul, she asked the question that would haunt her for the rest of her life. How many more nests still thrive? Chapter 14. The dust of the saints and the hunger of the damned. The transformation of Mother Agatha, once the feared matron of St. Margaret's, was not a death, but an unraveling. She began to age in reverse, not toward childhood, but toward entropy. Her skin cracked like old parchment, her hair turned to ash, and the weight of her stolen centuries collapsed upon her bones. The sacred substance, she gasped, her voice growing thin and dry like wind through dead reeds. Without it, we cannot maintain. For the first time, Catherine saw something like fear in the creature's eyes. Then came the final confession, soft and horrifying. We were human once. We were just like you. We came seeking faith, but found a hunger older than salvation. Her face, once falsely youthful, twisted into a grimace that was part hatred, part mourning. Remember us, not as monsters, but as a warning. And with that, she fell silent. The last of her form collapsed into dust. No scream, no redemption. Just a sudden absence like a candle extinguished in a tomb. The silence that followed. The other transformed sisters had already been reduced to ash and shadow beneath the force of Bishop Marley's invocations. The only sound that remained was the distant ringing of the consecrated bells outside and the quiet weeping of the 5 surviving novices. Catherine, Margaret, Clara, Rose, and Anne, each one holding themselves as if trying to reassemble what was left of their souls. But then came the true horror. In one of the basement chambers, the bishop's party discovered a row of novices still alive, not untouched, not saved, half changed. Their bodies were caught in some liminal state, skin gray and thin mouths, dark with dried blood, eyes wide with too much seeing. And worst of all, they were conscious, aware. They wept, they begged, they pleaded for death. We can't live like this, one whispered. But if we drink more, we'll become them. The bishop listened in silence, then kneeling before each one, he administered the last rites with tears running down his face. They died not as monsters, but as victims who had wandered too far into the machinery of corrupted belief. The 5 who lived. Of the 17 novices who had entered St. Margaret's Convent that winter, only 5 remained recognizably human, each one broken in different ways. Catherine Murphy, who had uncovered the truth, would never sleep without the sound of church bells again. Margaret, the daughter of a physician, would never again trust any ritual she did not perform herself. Anne Fitzgerald, once devout, would never pray aloud again. Rose McKenna would keep a crucifix by her bed until the day she died, and never again speak of her time at the convent. And Clara Walsh, brilliant Clara, would become a scholar in silence, writing under pseudonyms, chronicling the places where theology and terror overlap. The aftermath, Bishop Marley ordered a full investigation, but no report would ever reach the public. The church's official account was sterile. St. Margaret's Convent was closed due to administrative irregularities. The building was dismantled stone by stone, each slab inspected for relics, each chamber emptied with holy water and fire. What the investigators found would haunt them. Bones of girls who had transferred to other houses. Blood-preserved ledgers detailing rites never recorded in any Christian doctrine. Maps, yes maps of similar convents stretching from Quebec to Lisbon, Prague to Argentina. St. Margaret's was not unique. It was a node in a network, a secret, sealed in marble. All documentation from the investigation was sealed in the Vatican Apostolic Archives under a designation known only to a handful of living clerics. Even now, over 175 years later, the archives remain sealed. The 5 surviving women were relocated, their names changed, their histories sanitized, and in the private records of Bishop Marley, who would later be canonized for unrelated acts of bravery during the famine years, there is a single handwritten note. There is no victory, only vigilance, legacy, and dread. No monument marks the location of St. Margaret's. No parish remembers its name, but among certain priests, certain archivists, and certain secret orders within the church, the story is still told not as a tale of triumph, but as a cautionary liturgy, because faith is not invulnerable. It can be twisted. It can be fed upon. It can be used as camouflage by the very things it was meant to protect us from. And sometimes the bells are too late.